The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Command training facility in Coronado, California. Sarah Martinez adjusted her instructor uniform one final time before stepping into the crowd of 300 Navy SEALs gathered for the annual combat readiness demonstration. As the first female hand-to-hand combat instructor ever assigned to train elite special forces, she carried the weight of breaking barriers on her shoulders every single day. The sea breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and determination that had become Sarah's daily companion over the past 18 months. She had fought tooth and nail to earn her position here, enduring skepticism, subtle discrimination, and outright hostility from some quarters. But her credentials spoke louder than any doubt. A third-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, certified Krav Maga instructor, and former Marine Corps combatives champion, Sarah had proven herself time and again in sparring matches that left even the most seasoned warriors nursing their pride along with their bruises. Today was different, though. Today, she would demonstrate advanced defensive techniques to the largest gathering of SEALs she had ever faced. The demonstration was part of a new initiative to incorporate more diverse fighting styles into special operations training, and Sarah knew that success here could open doors for other women seeking to serve in similar capacities. Commander James Mitchell, a 20-year veteran with silver hair and weathered hands that had seen combat in 3 different theaters, approached her with a clipboard and a reassuring smile. "Martinez, you ready for this circus?" His tone was warm, a stark contrast to the reception she had received from some other senior officers when she first arrived. "Ready as I'll ever be, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had spent weeks preparing for this demonstration, studying every technique, anticipating every possible scenario that might arise when working with unfamiliar partners. "Good. Remember, these men have been training together for years. Some of them might test you, see if you're really as good as your reputation suggests. Don't let them rattle you." Mitchell's eyes scanned the crowd of assembled SEALs, most of whom were stretching and talking in small groups, their conversations a low hum of anticipation. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She had dealt with testing before, sometimes in the form of overly aggressive sparring partners who seemed more interested in proving a point than learning new techniques. She had learned to channel that aggression, using it as fuel for her own performance while maintaining the professionalism that had earned her this position. The crowd began to settle as Mitchell called for attention. Sarah took her position at the center of the training mat, a large blue surface that had witnessed countless hours of grappling, striking, and the occasional injury that came with high-intensity training. She began with basic warm-up exercises, leading the group through stretches and movement patterns that would prepare their bodies for the more demanding techniques to follow. "Today we're focusing on close-quarters defensive techniques," Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the training area. "These methods are designed for situations where you're caught off guard, potentially outnumbered, or dealing with an opponent who has size and strength advantages." She demonstrated the first series of movements slowly, breaking down each component for maximum clarity. The SEALs watched intently, some taking notes, others mentally cataloging the techniques for later practice. Sarah had learned that the best way to earn respect from elite warriors was through competence and clarity, and she had prepared meticulously to ensure both. As the demonstration progressed, Sarah called for volunteers to serve as practice partners. Hands shot up throughout the crowd, and she selected a mix of ranks and experience levels to ensure the techniques would be relevant to everyone present. The first few volunteers approached with obvious respect, following her instructions precisely and allowing her to showcase the effectiveness of each defensive movement. Then, Marcus Webb stepped forward. Webb was everything that Sarah had learned to be wary of in her military career. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with the build of someone who had spent years turning physical fitness into a personal obsession, he carried himself with the swagger that sometimes came with elite status and too few challenges to his worldview. His reputation preceded him, a collection of stories about his aggressive training style and his vocal opinions about women in combat roles. "I'll be your next volunteer," Webb announced, not waiting to be selected. His voice carried a tone that Sarah immediately recognized, the subtle challenge wrapped in the veneer of cooperation. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, nodding acknowledgement while mentally shifting into a higher state of alertness. She had dealt with men like Webb before, individuals who saw her presence as a challenge to be overcome rather than an opportunity to learn. "Thank you for volunteering. We'll be demonstrating defensive responses to grab attempts. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the shift in energy that occurred whenever Webb entered a training scenario. Some of the SEALs exchanged glances, recognizing the signs of a situation that might escalate beyond the bounds of normal demonstration protocols. Sarah explained the technique clearly, describing how to use an attacker's momentum against them when faced with an aggressive grab or hold. Webb nodded along, but his body language suggested he was planning something beyond the scripted demonstration. His hands flexed repeatedly, a nervous habit that Sarah noted while continuing her explanation. The key is to remain calm and use precise leverage points rather than trying to match strength with strength, Sarah continued, positioning herself for the demonstration. Remember, this is about technique, not power. Webb moved into position, and, for a moment, everything proceeded as planned. Sarah demonstrated the initial defensive position, showing how to create space and identify the opponent's vulnerable points. But, as they moved through the sequence, Webb's grip tightened beyond what the demonstration required. Easier said than done when you're dealing with someone who's not playing games, Webb muttered, loud enough for the nearby SEALs to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah felt the shift immediately. What had begun as a training demonstration was morphing into something more personal, more dangerous. Webb's grip on her wrist tightened further, his other hand moving to grab her shoulder in a way that had nothing to do with the technique they were supposed to be practicing. The crowd's murmur died away as the tension became palpable. Sarah could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching her handle this moment. She knew that her response would define not just this demonstration, but potentially her entire future with the special operations community. "Let's stick to the plan technique," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent training area. It was a professional warning, delivered with the calm authority of someone who had faced similar situations before. Webb's response was to tighten his grip even more, his face showing a slight smirk that suggested he was enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Maybe we should see how these techniques work under real pressure," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made several SEALs in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Sarah had reached a decision point that every instructor eventually faces, the moment when professionalism must be balanced against self-protection. She had tried the diplomatic approach, had given Webb every opportunity to return to appropriate behavior. His continued escalation left her with limited options. "Release your grip and step back," Sarah commanded, her tone shifting from instructor to something harder, more direct. It was the voice of someone who had been tested before and had learned not to back down from necessary confrontations. Instead of complying, Webb made his fatal mistake. Perhaps emboldened by the audience, perhaps driven by whatever personal issues had motivated his behavior from the beginning, he decided to escalate further. His free hand, the one that had been resting on her shoulder, drew back with clear intent to strike. The movement was unmistakable, a telegraphed attack that crossed every line of appropriate behavior. In that instant, Webb transformed from an inappropriate training partner into an actual threat, someone attempting to assault an instructor in front of 300 witnesses. Sarah's response was instantaneous and precise, the product of years of training and the muscle memory that had been drilled into her through countless hours of practice. As Webb's hand moved toward her, she executed a perfect defensive sequence that would have made her instructors proud. She ducked slightly, avoiding the path of his intended strike while simultaneously grabbing his extended wrist with both hands. Using his forward momentum against him, she pivoted her body and applied a leverage technique that was as beautiful in its simplicity as it was devastating in its effectiveness. The sound that followed would echo in the memories of everyone present for years to come. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of bone under stress, followed immediately by Webb's scream of pain and shock. His forearm had snapped cleanly, the result of forces he had never experienced and hadn't been prepared to handle. Webb dropped to his knees, cradling his broken arm against his chest, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. The aggressive posture that had defined his approach to the demonstration was gone, replaced by the vulnerability of someone who had just learned a hard lesson about the consequences of crossing certain lines. The training area fell into complete silence, 300 elite warriors processing what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood over Webb's kneeling form, her breathing steady, her stance still defensive but controlled. She had not lost her temper, had not acted in anger or vindication. Everything she had done was a textbook response to an assault, executed with the precision and restraint that marked true expertise. Commander Mitchell was the first to move, stepping forward to assess the situation and begin the process of managing the aftermath. Medical personnel, always present during training demonstrations, rushed toward Webb to evaluate his injury and provide initial treatment. Sarah remained in position for several more seconds, ensuring that the threat had truly passed before relaxing her defensive stance. Around her, the crowd of SEALs watched with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to concern about what would happen next. The demonstration had taken a turn that no one had anticipated, but Sarah had handled herself with the professionalism and skill that had earned her the position in the first place. She had been tested in the most public way possible, and her response would become part of the legend that would follow her throughout her career. As medical personnel attended to Webb's injury and commanders began the process of investigating what had just occurred, Sarah knew that this moment would define her relationship with the special operations community for years to come. She had proven herself under pressure, but she also knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The sun continued to shine down on the training facility, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as a routine demonstration had become something much more significant, a moment that would be remembered and discussed long after Webb's arm had healed and the formal investigations had concluded. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the human drama playing out on the training grounds. But, for Sarah Martinez and the 300 Navy SEALs who had witnessed her response to an unprovoked attack, this morning had become a defining moment that would influence careers, perceptions, and policies for years to come. The medical bay at Naval Special Warfare Command had seen its share of training injuries over the years, but the tension in the air that afternoon was different. Marcus Webb sat on the examination table, his forearm now properly set and wrapped in a cast that would serve as a visible reminder of the morning's events for the next 6 weeks. His face had lost the cocky confidence that had characterized his approach to the training demonstration, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like shame mixed with lingering anger. Dr. Patricia Chen, the base's chief medical officer, finished her examination with the thoroughness that had made her reputation among the special operations community. She had treated everything from gunshot wounds to exotic tropical diseases during her 12 years at Coronado, but the circumstances surrounding this particular injury required extra attention to detail. "The break is clean," she told the assembled group, which included Commander Mitchell, the base's legal officer Captain Rodriguez, and the investigating officer who had been assigned to document the incident. "Radius and ulna, standard defensive break pattern. Consistent with a leverage technique applied with significant force." Sarah Martinez stood near the back of the room, still wearing her training uniform but now accompanied by her assigned counsel, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes from the Judge Advocate General's office. The presence of legal representation on both sides had transformed what might have been a simple training accident into something much more complex and potentially career-defining. "For the record," Dr. Chen continued, "this type of injury requires considerable skill to execute without causing permanent damage. Whoever applied the technique knew exactly what they were doing." Her professional assessment carried weight in the room, where everyone understood the difference between reckless force and controlled application of defensive skills. Captain Rodriguez, a meticulous man who had built his reputation on fair but thorough investigations, made notes in his tablet while considering the medical evidence. As the senior legal officer, he would be responsible for determining whether formal charges should be filed and, if so, against whom. "Mr. Webb," Rodriguez addressed the injured SEAL directly, "are you ready to provide your formal statement regarding this morning's incident?" Webb shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, his good hand flexing in the same nervous pattern Sarah had noticed during the demonstration. The presence of his own legal counsel, Lieutenant Murphy, seemed to provide little comfort as he struggled to find words that would explain his actions without completely destroying his career. "I was participating in the demonstration like everyone else," Webb began, his voice lacking the confidence that had marked his earlier behavior. "Things got more intense than they should have, and I guess I got carried away with the realism of the scenario." Rodriguez looked up from his notes, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with the attention to detail that had served him well during dozens of similar investigations. "Mr. Webb, I need you to be more specific about your actions during the demonstration." Multiple witnesses report that you grabbed Instructor Martinez in a manner inconsistent with the planned exercise and, then, appeared to attempt to strike her. Can you explain those actions? The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah found herself holding her breath, understanding that Webb's response would largely determine the direction of the investigation and, potentially, her own future with the special operations community. Webb's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he spoke again. Look, I thought we were supposed to be testing these techniques under realistic conditions. Martinez is always talking about how her methods work against bigger, stronger opponents. I wanted to see if that was actually true or just classroom theory. Lieutenant Murphy, Webb's counsel, leaned forward slightly, clearly uncomfortable with his client's explanation. As an experienced military lawyer, he understood the implications of what Webb was suggesting and the ways it could be interpreted by investigators and, potentially, a court-martial panel. So you intentionally escalated the demonstration beyond the planned parameters? Rodriguez asked, his tone carefully measured. And, you attempted to strike Instructor Martinez during what was supposed to be a controlled training exercise? I didn't try to hit her, Webb protested, but his words lacked conviction. I was just testing her reflexes. Seeing if she could really handle pressure. Commander Mitchell, who had remained silent during most of the medical examination and initial questioning, finally spoke up. His voice carried the weight of 2 decades of leadership experience and the frustration of someone who had worked hard to maintain professional standards in his command. Son, I've been running training operations for longer than you've been in the Navy. I know the difference between realistic training and inappropriate behavior. What I saw this morning crossed lines that should never be crossed, regardless of anyone's opinions about new training methods or instructors. The rebuke hit Webb visibly, his shoulders sagging as he began to understand the serious nature of his situation. Around the room, the other participants in the investigation process continued their documentation, each understanding their role in ensuring that the facts would be properly preserved and evaluated. Sarah had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, following the advice of her counsel to observe and listen rather than volunteer information that might complicate her position. But, as she watched Webb struggle to explain his actions, she felt a complex mix of emotions that had little to do with the legal proceedings. Part of her felt genuine sympathy for a fellow service member whose career was likely about to take a dramatic turn for the worse. She had never wanted to seriously injure anyone during training, and the fact that Webb's arm had been broken in front of so many witnesses bothered her more than she was willing to admit publicly. At the same time, Sarah understood that Webb's behavior represented something larger and more troubling than a single incident of poor judgment. His actions had been the culmination of attitudes and beliefs that had made her daily work environment more challenging from the moment she arrived at Coronado. Instructor Martinez, Captain Rodriguez turned his attention to her. I understand you've already provided a preliminary statement to the investigating officer. Is there anything you'd like to add or clarify about the events of this morning? Sarah glanced at Lieutenant Commander Hayes, who nodded slightly, before responding. Sir, I followed standard defensive protocols when faced with what I perceived to be an assault. My training and experience taught me to respond with appropriate force to neutralize a threat, which is exactly what I did. And, in your professional opinion, was Mr. Webb's behavior consistent with normal training protocols? Rodriguez continued his questioning with the same careful attention to detail he had applied to Webb's statement. No, sir. His grip pressure exceeded what was necessary for the demonstration, he ignored my verbal instructions to modify his technique, and his attempt to strike me was completely outside the bounds of any training scenario I've ever encountered. Sarah's response was clear and professional, the product of years of experience in high-stress situations and careful coaching from her legal counsel. Dr. Chen had been taking notes throughout the questioning, and she looked up from her clipboard with an expression that suggested she had something important to add. If I may, Captain Rodriguez, the medical evidence supports Instructor Martinez's account. The grip marks on her wrists are consistent with excessive force, and the defensive injuries on her hands indicate she was protecting herself rather than initiating an attack. The medical officer's professional opinion carried significant weight in the room, providing objective evidence that supported Sarah's version of events. Rodriguez made additional notes while considering the implications of the doctor's findings. Outside the medical bay, word of the morning's incident had spread throughout the base with the speed that characterized any military community where news traveled faster than official communications. Groups of SEALs discussed the events in hushed tones, their conversations reflecting a mix of perspectives that would influence the social dynamics at Coronado for months to come. Some focused on the technical aspects of Sarah's defensive technique, praising her skill while questioning whether such force had been necessary. Others examined Webb's behavior through the lens of military discipline and professional standards, finding his actions clearly inappropriate regardless of their opinions about women in combat roles. A smaller but vocal group wondered whether the entire incident represented deeper tensions about changing roles and expectations within the special operations community. These conversations were more complex and, potentially more divisive, touching on issues of tradition, capability, and the evolving nature of military service. Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan, a 28-year veteran who had served as an unofficial mentor to dozens of young SEALs, found himself fielding questions and concerns from men he had trained and guided throughout their careers. His responses were measured and thoughtful, reflecting the wisdom that came with decades of experience in leadership positions. The bottom line is simple, Sullivan told a group of senior enlisted men who had sought his perspective. We all saw what happened. Webb stepped over the line, and Martinez responded appropriately to defend herself. Everything else is just noise that distracts from the real lessons we should be learning from this situation. His words carried weight among the senior enlisted community, helping to shape opinions and reduce some of the speculation that might otherwise have complicated the investigation and its aftermath. Sullivan understood that leadership during controversial situations required clarity and consistency, qualities that would be essential for maintaining unit cohesion. Back in the medical bay, the formal questioning continued as investigators worked to document every aspect of the incident. Webb's statement had raised more questions than it answered, particularly regarding his motivations and his understanding of appropriate training protocols. Mr. Webb, Rodriguez continued, help me understand your mindset during the demonstration. Did you harbor any personal animosity toward Instructor Martinez that might have influenced your behavior? The question struck at the heart of what many suspected had motivated Webb's actions. His reputation for making disparaging comments about women in combat roles was well known, though proving a connection between his attitudes and his behavior would require careful documentation and testimony from witnesses. Webb's hesitation before answering spoke volumes to everyone in the room. His legal counsel leaned over to whisper something in his ear, clearly advising caution in his response to such a loaded question. I don't have any personal issues with Martinez specifically, Webb finally said, his words carefully chosen but lacking the conviction that might have made them believable. I just think standards should be the same for everyone, regardless of their background or gender. Rodriguez made extensive notes about Webb's response, understanding that the investigation would need to explore the broader context of his attitudes and their potential influence on the morning's events. The legal implications of proving discriminatory intent were complex, but the military justice system took such considerations seriously when evaluating misconduct cases. As the afternoon wore on, the investigation continued to gather momentum. Witness statements were collected from the SEALs who had observed the demonstration, each providing their own perspective on what they had seen and heard. The consistency of these accounts would prove crucial in establishing the facts and determining appropriate consequences. Commander Mitchell found himself in the difficult position of balancing his responsibility to support his personnel while ensuring that justice was served appropriately. The incident had occurred under his command, during a program he had championed, involving instructors and students he was responsible for developing and maintaining. The political implications extended beyond Coronado to higher levels of the military hierarchy, where questions about women in combat roles remained sensitive and controversial. The way this incident was handled would send messages throughout the special operations community about acceptable behavior and the consequences of crossing established boundaries. Sarah's thoughts during the long afternoon of questioning and investigation were complex and deeply personal. She had achieved a position that represented years of hard work and dedication, only to find herself at the center of a controversy that might define her military career regardless of the investigation's outcome. The technical aspects of her response to Webb's aggression had been flawless, a textbook application of defensive techniques that any instructor would have been proud to demonstrate. But the human cost of that success, measured in Webb's broken arm and the divisive aftermath, weighed heavily on her conscience. As evening approached and the initial phase of the investigation concluded, Sarah knew that the real challenges lay ahead. The formal inquiry would take weeks to complete, during which time she would continue her duties while living under the scrutiny that came with being at the center of a high-profile incident. The training facility where everything had begun that morning remained empty now, the mats cleaned and stored until the next day's activities would bring new students and new challenges. But the echoes of what had occurred there would resonate throughout the special operations community for months to come, influencing policies, attitudes, and careers in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting alone in the base cafeteria during what should have been the lunch rush. The normally bustling space felt uncomfortably quiet around her, conversations dying as she passed by and resuming in hushed tones once she was out of immediate earshot. The invisible barriers that had formed around her since that morning on the training mat were as effective as any physical wall in creating isolation. Her apartment off base had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where she could escape the constant scrutiny but also where the silence gave her too much time to replay every moment of the confrontation with Webb. Sleep came irregularly, interrupted by dreams that mixed the sound of breaking bone with the faces of 300 watching seals, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The official investigation continued its methodical progress under Captain Rodriguez's careful supervision, but the informal court of opinion had already reached its various verdicts. Sarah found herself categorized differently by different groups within the base community, each applying their own lens to interpret what had happened and what it meant for the future. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister Maria, a high school teacher in San Diego who had been following the story through carefully worded conversations that avoided the details Sarah couldn't discuss while the investigation remained active. "Coffee tonight? You sound like you need to get out of your head for a while." The invitation was tempting, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about public appearances since the incident had begun generating interest beyond the military community. Someone had leaked details to a blogger who specialized in military affairs, and, while the coverage had been generally factual, the attention made her nervous about uncontrolled social situations. "Rain check," she texted back. "Still dealing with official stuff." The response came immediately. "Sarah, you're isolating yourself. That's not healthy, and it's not going to help your career or your peace of mind. One cup of coffee with your sister isn't going to compromise anything." Maria's persistence was both annoying and comforting, reflecting the kind of straightforward concern that had characterized their relationship since childhood. As the older of 2 daughters raised by a single mother who worked double shifts to keep them fed and housed, Sarah had learned early to be self-reliant and protective of those she cared about. The irony wasn't lost on her that those same protective instincts had been at the heart of her response to Webb's aggression. She had defended herself with the same determined efficiency that she had once used to deal with neighborhood bullies who targeted her family because of their economic circumstances or her mother's immigrant status. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the base psychologist who had been assigned to provide counseling support during the investigation, had made similar observations during their weekly sessions. The professional discussions had helped Sarah understand the broader context of her emotional responses, but they hadn't eliminated the daily challenges of living under scrutiny and suspicion. Trauma responses don't always manifest as obvious symptoms, Dr. Walsh had explained during their most recent session. Sometimes they show up as hypervigilance, social isolation, or obsessive analysis of events that are beyond your control. The fact that you handled the physical confrontation successfully doesn't mean you're immune to the psychological aftereffects. The observation had been insightful but not particularly comforting. Sarah had built her identity around being strong, capable, and unshakable under pressure. The idea that she might be struggling with something as seemingly abstract as psychological trauma felt like an admission of weakness she wasn't prepared to make. A knock on her apartment door interrupted her brooding thoughts about isolation and trauma. Through the peephole, she saw Commander Mitchell standing in the hallway, looking tired and older than she remembered from their regular interactions before the incident. His presence at her home was unexpected and potentially significant, given the ongoing nature of the investigation. "Good evening, sir," she said after opening the door and stepping aside to allow him entry. "Is everything all right?" Mitchell settled into her small living room with the careful movements of someone carrying more weight than his physical frame suggested. His expression was serious but not hostile, the look of a leader dealing with complex problems that had no easy solutions. "I wanted to check on you personally, away from the official channels and formal procedures," he began. "How are you holding up under all this pressure?" The question was simple but loaded with implications about her fitness for duty, her emotional stability, and her ability to continue serving effectively despite the ongoing controversy. Sarah chose her words carefully, understanding that Mitchell's assessment of her condition would influence decisions about her future assignments and career trajectory. "I'm managing, sir. The situation is obviously stressful, but I'm continuing to fulfill my duties and cooperate with the investigation as required." Her response was professional and measured, revealing nothing that could be interpreted as doubt or weakness. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her careful composure. "Sarah, I've been doing this job long enough to know the difference between someone who's actually doing well and someone who's just holding it together through willpower and stubbornness. Which category do you think you fall into right now?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, penetrating the professional barriers she had constructed around her emotional state. For a moment, she considered maintaining the facade of unshakable competence that had served her throughout her military career. But something in Mitchell's tone suggested that honesty might be more valuable than bravado. "Probably the second category, sir," she admitted quietly. "But I don't think falling apart is an option, given everything that's at stake with this situation." "Falling apart and acknowledging that you're under enormous pressure are two different things," Mitchell replied. "What happened on that training mat 3 weeks ago was textbook defensive technique applied under extreme provocation. But that doesn't mean you have to pretend it was just another day at the office." His validation of her actions provided some comfort, but Sarah understood that personal support from her commanding officer didn't necessarily translate into professional protection if the investigation's conclusions proved politically inconvenient for the command structure. The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door, this one more tentative and accompanied by a familiar voice calling her name. "Sarah? It's Tom. I know you're probably not interested in company, but I wanted to make sure you're okay." Tom Bradley was one of the few SEALs who had made an effort to maintain normal interactions with Sarah since the incident. A 10-year veteran with deployment experience in multiple theaters, he had been present during the demonstration and had later provided a witness statement that strongly supported her version of events. Sarah glanced at Mitchell, who nodded his approval for her to answer the door. Tom's presence in the hallway represented both moral support and potential complications, given the various factions that had formed within the base community regarding the incident and its implications. "Commander," Tom acknowledged Mitchell's presence with appropriate respect while clearly being surprised to find him there. "I didn't realize you were here. I can come back another time." "Actually, this might be a good opportunity for me to hear how the enlisted community is processing what happened," Mitchell replied. "Have a seat, Tom. What's the word among your peers about this whole situation?" Tom's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to respond honestly without compromising anyone's position or revealing information that might prove problematic for ongoing investigations. His loyalty to Sarah was clear, but he also understood the complexities of military politics and career management. "Sir, there are definitely mixed opinions," Tom began carefully. "Most of the guys who were there that day understand that Webb crossed a line and that Sarah did what she had to do to protect herself. The technique was clean, the application was precise, and the response was proportional to the threat." He paused, clearly struggling with how much detail to provide about more problematic perspectives within the community. "But there are also some who think the whole thing could have been handled differently, maybe defused before it reached the point where someone got seriously injured." Mitchell made mental notes about Tom's assessment while considering the political implications of ongoing divisions within his command. Unit cohesion was essential for effective special operations, and unresolved tensions about the incident could undermine mission effectiveness if they weren't addressed appropriately. "What about Webb?" Sarah asked quietly.
How is he handling everything? Tom's expression darkened slightly, suggesting that Webb's behavior since the incident had been less than exemplary. He's been pretty bitter about the whole thing. Keeps talking about how he was just trying to provide realistic training scenarios and got attacked for his efforts. Some of the younger guys seemed to be buying into his version of events. The information was troubling but not entirely unexpected. Sarah had anticipated that Webb would attempt to reshape the narrative in ways that minimized his culpability while portraying himself as a victim of excessive response to legitimate training methods. Has he been spreading his version of events widely? Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting that such behavior might constitute additional misconduct that could affect the investigation's outcomes. Not directly, sir. But he's definitely not discouraging the guys who want to see things his way, and he's been making comments about standards and special treatment that are pretty clearly directed at Sarah's situation. Tom's discomfort with reporting on a fellow SEAL was obvious, but his loyalty to accuracy and fairness outweighed his reluctance to share potentially damaging information. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from practical concerns about training protocols to broader questions about community dynamics and professional relationships. Mitchell's presence helped facilitate discussions that might have been more difficult in a purely informal setting, while Tom's perspective provided insights into enlisted attitudes that weren't always visible to the officer community. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself feeling more connected to her professional community than she had since the incident occurred. The isolation that had characterized the previous 3 weeks wasn't entirely self-imposed, it was also the product of uncertainty about who could be trusted and who might be gathering information for purposes that weren't necessarily supportive of her interests. Sarah, Mitchell said as he prepared to leave, I want you to know that this command values your contributions and recognizes the professionalism you've shown throughout this difficult period. Whatever the investigation concludes, you've handled yourself with the kind of integrity that reflects well on the entire program. His words provided some comfort, but Sarah understood that good intentions and personal support might not be enough to protect her career if political pressures or institutional biases influenced the final disposition of the case. The military justice system was generally fair, but it also operated within broader contexts that included public relations concerns and policy considerations. After Mitchell left, Tom remained for another hour, their conversation shifting to more personal topics that reflected the genuine friendship that had developed during their professional interactions. He had been one of the few people who had treated her as a competent professional from her first day at Coronado, never questioning her credentials or abilities based on her gender or background. You know, Tom said as he prepared to leave, whatever happens with the official investigation, you've already proven everything you needed to prove out there. The fact that some people don't want to acknowledge that says more about them than it does about you. His support meant more to Sarah than she was willing to admit, representing the kind of professional respect and personal friendship that made the military lifestyle worthwhile despite its many challenges and sacrifices. The knowledge that she had earned genuine acceptance from at least some members of the elite community she served provided strength for facing the uncertainties ahead. That night, sleep came more easily than it had in weeks, interrupted only briefly by dreams that mixed familiar training scenarios with new faces and situations. The conversations with Mitchell and Tom had helped restore some sense of connection to her professional community, reminding her that isolation was often a choice rather than an inevitable consequence of difficult circumstances. The investigation would continue, Webb would pursue his own agenda, and the broader special operations community would eventually reach its collective judgment about what had happened and what it meant for the future. But, for the first time since the incident occurred, Sarah felt confident that she had the support and resources necessary to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning would bring new developments, additional pressures, and ongoing uncertainties about her future. But it would also bring renewed determination to continue serving with the professionalism and competence that had brought her to Coronado in the first place, regardless of the obstacles that others might place in her path.